The United College Distinguished Visiting Scholar Scheme is made possible by the generous support of the College Endowment Fund. Under this scheme, United College is able to invite internationally renowned scholars to Hong Kong to give public lectures and meet staff and students from the college and the university. The college is honored to have invited Professor Andrew Chan from the Harvard Medical School as our distinguished visiting scholar this year. Without further ado, I would like to pass over the floor to the moderator of today's lecture, Professor Martin Wong. Professor Wong is from the Jockey Club School of Public Health and Primary Care, and he is also the Associate College Head and the Dean of Students of the United College. May I now invite Professor Wong to introduce Professor Chan and the topic of this afternoon. Professor Wong, please.
So thank you very much, Professor Andrew Chan, Professor Stephen Wong, Professor Peter Zheng, Professor Bruce Lee, Professor S.W. Tang, and also distinguished guests, colleagues, students, ladies and gentlemen. So good afternoon to all of you. It's my great pleasure to be here today again to introduce Professor Andrew T. Chan, the Distinguished Visiting Scholar of the United College in the year 2023-24. Professor Chan is an exceptional figure in the field of gastroenterology and cancer prevention, and we are privileged to have him as our distinguished scholar this year. This is the second lecture delivered by Professor Chan within this week. For guests and students who did not attend Monday's lecture, allow me to introduce Professor Chan again. Professor Chan's impressive list of credentials and accomplishments truly speaks for itself. As the Daniel K. Podolsky Professor of Medicine at Harvard Medical School, Professor of Immunology and Infectious Diseases at Harvard Teach Chan School of Public Health, and Chief of the Clinical and Translational Epidemiology Unit at Massachusetts General Hospital, his expertise is renowned globally. Furthermore, he serves as the Director of Epidemiology at the MGH Cancer Center and co-leader of the Cancer Epidemiology Program of the Dana-Farber Harvard Cancer Center. Professor Chan's contributions to the medical field have been recognized through his membership in prestigious societies, including the American Society for Clinical Investigation and the Association of American Physicians, as well as his appointment as an American Cancer Society Clinical Research Professor. Throughout his career, Professor Chan has dedicated his research efforts to preventing colorectal cancer through preventive drugs and lifestyle interventions. His groundbreaking work encompasses the epidemiology of the gut microbiome, gastrointestinal bleeding, inflammatory bowel disease, and gallstone diseases. The impact of his research extends far, far beyond publications, significantly influencing clinical practices and benefiting countless patients worldwide. It's worth noting that Professor Chan's outstanding contributions in cancer prevention have not gone unnoticed. Because in the year 2021, he was recognized as one of the 50 change makers in cancer prevention by the National Cancer Institute. And also in the year 2022, he was honored as an American Cancer Society Clinical Research Professor, which is the highest distinction bestowed by the foundation, acknowledging his pioneering work and exceptional mentorship. In addition to his research endeavors, Professor Chan has displayed exemplary leadership skills by mentoring over 30 investigators who have now become independent faculty members with their own extramural funding. He has also played a pivotal role in developing evidence-based clinical practice guidelines in gastroenterology. And as a clinician, Professor Chan provides comprehensive care in general gastroenterology and specializes in endoscopy for patients with high-risk cancer genetic syndromes. So I think a lot of us actually really agree that Professor Chan has already delivered a very insightful lecture about aspirin and cancer prevention this Monday. And the second lecture today, Professor Chan will highlight the significance of human gut microbiome, which plays a crucial role in immunity and chronic inflammation. The composition and function of the gut microbiome are influenced by at least lifestyle factors, particularly diet, and maintaining a balance is really essential for optimal health. Professor Chan will specifically address the impact of diet on the gut microbiome and its implications for human metabolism. So without further ado, may we now invite Professor Chan to deliver the lecture on diet, the gut microbiome, and human health. Professor Chan, please.
Thank you, Professor Wong. It's really a pleasure to be here and an honor to be this year's visiting scholar. As Professor Wong had mentioned, I've been here for the last week and really had a wonderful opportunity to be able to share and have a scientific exchange with many members of the faculty and also students as well. And it's been a tremendous opportunity for me to learn also from you all in terms of what are exciting areas of science within this university and also what are exciting developments within Hong Kong. As many of you might have heard if you were at my lecture on Monday, I do have a very warm relationship with Hong Kong, having spent some time here when I was a medical student. I had a scholarship to come to Hong Kong in this university at the Prince of Wales Hospital where I did some cancer research, and that was really a formative experience in terms of really igniting my interest in research. And so it's been really nice to be able to come back to Hong Kong and really have this experience to kind of come back full circle to be with all of you. So as Professor Wong had mentioned, my interest is in prevention of gastrointestinal cancer and other digestive diseases. And I come at this from the perspective of being a physician, a gastroenterologist, but also being an epidemiologist and someone who does public health research. And my mission has been to really use public health and use epidemiological methods to be able to lead to clinical translation. And I realize many of you in the audience today have many different backgrounds and many different interests, but I hope today I'll be able to demonstrate to you how valuable it is to think about some of the really exciting developments that are happening within the field of microbiome science, because I think it will have an impact on human health for many years to come. And whether you're a physician or a public health specialist or even a layperson, I think this will be an area of science that people will be very, very interested in seeing blossom in the next few years. So by way of disclosures, I do have some relationships with some private companies that have interests in gastrointestinal cancer prevention and microbiome science. And this is really an outline of what I'm going to be discussing today. I'd like to take you through a few areas about the gut microbiome that I think are particularly interesting and to really lay the field for you so you can understand much about the foundation of the microbiome field, but also give you some useful examples of how the gut microbiome is really transforming how we think about human health and how we're thinking about the microbiome in disease prevention. So the first task will be just to give you, particularly those people that may not have background in microbiome science, an understanding of what is the gut microbiome and what does that terminology mean. And then we'll talk a little bit about how the microbiome has an important role in determining human health, and also really start to lay the groundwork for helping you understand why diet and what we eat and the food that we eat really has an influence on our gut microbiome, and how that in turn may play a role in how healthy we are and how we can sort of prevent the development of chronic disease. And then I will focus on two examples of where microbiome science is its most advanced. One is the area of microbiome and colorectal cancer, and the other is microbiome and diet and how that relates to metabolic health. and how that also potentially may have an influence on such difficult conditions like overweight, obesity, diabetes, and heart disease. And then finally give you just a summary of where we are in the field. So to first lay the background, I want to address three basic questions, particularly for those of you who have not had an opportunity to know much about the microbiome. The first question is, what is the gut microbiome? The second is, how does the gut microbiome actually play a role in human health? And then the third question that I like to really address is, how is it that diet actually is important in the microbiome? So what is a microbiome? Why is a microbiome, and when is a microbiome? So microbiome comes from the word micro, and the micro comes from microbiology. And as you know from taking basic biology classes, we know that microbiology encompasses the study of multiple microorganisms or microscopic size organisms that reside in the general environment. In addition, when we add the word biome to it, we're talking about the community of microorganisms that live in our environment. And we also want to think about not only the community, but also what is a microbial community. And a microbial community really consists of multiple different species of microorganisms that live together in a community. It could be as few as 2, it could be as many as 100. And we want to basically also think about the microbiome in the context of what are the elements of those microbes. Specifically, what are the genes? What are the genes that make up these microbes? And how do the genes in turn in these microbes lead to proteins and lead to different metabolites that may have a role in human health? So this is just a very basic definition of what a microbiome is. Now, many environments have a microbiome. We know that the natural environment has a microbiome. So just looking at our physical environment, we know that whether you live in Hong Kong or live in the United States or live in Europe, your natural environment also has a unique community of microorganisms. In addition, we know there's also a microbiome associated with built environments. And built environments have to do with what is it that humans have actually developed in the terms of cities and agriculture and development. That actually also influences our microbiome and also leads to the development of a specific community of microorganisms. And then the last is really a host environment. And when I say host, what I mean is we all also have to think about the interaction of these microorganisms with other species and other things that live on Earth, specifically other animals. And so we think about the host microbiome with respect to, for example, what is the specific group of microbes that live in conjunction with plants or specific animals or specific agricultural environments. And in particular, when we talk about the gut microbiome, we talk about humans, we're talking about how does our own bodies and how does our own human environment actually also provide an environment for the microbiome. So what is the human microbiome? So when I say the human microbiome, I'm talking about the sort of community of microorganisms that live within our bodies. And as many of you know, we have many, many, many cells that make up the human body. But even more than human cells, we have many, many more cells that belong to other organisms that actually reside within our own bodies. And these are mostly microorganisms that actually live in the human gut. And if you think about the human gut, beyond the skin, which is the environment in which we are exposing our bodies to the rest of the world, the gut is the main source of exposure and interaction with our environment. When you think about what you actually ingest in terms of food and what you drink in terms of liquid, that is putting you into contact with what's in the environment. And as a result, within our gut and within our intestines lives an entire community of microorganisms, bacteria, viruses, etc., that comprise what we call the gut microbiome. And because it is such a rich environment of different cells and different microorganisms, we can also consider it to be another organ. It can be considered something beyond, something in addition to the heart or the lungs or the stomach or the liver. It provides a source of metabolism and a source of physiological energy for our bodies that exists in the context of our gastrointestinal tract. And we know that the microbiome covers many different parts of our body, but the gut is where probably the vast majority of microorganisms reside in our body. And we now know over many, many years of study that these microbes and these different bacteria, viruses, and small microorganisms in our body actually plays a role in our health, both in terms of determining our metabolism, but also in determining immunity. And there have been many studies that have shown, for example, that there are strong relationships between the incidence of specific disorders of the human body, particularly immune disorders, and the gut microbiome. And as you can see in this schematic, there have been many different associations in which immune disorders have risen in incidence, as we've also had fundamental alterations in our gut microbiome. So what actually defines health and what is disease in the gut microbiome? So this just gives you a schematic of and a review of the field in terms of where are there clear associations between health and the gut microbiome. And this was a very nice review paper that actually summarized what were sort of disease associations that had been uncovered in various studies, which demonstrate that there's a fundamental difference in the gut microbiome of somebody that has a disease versus someone who is healthy. And these are the leading examples of diseases where the microbiome seems to be different in people with these diseases. This includes cirrhosis of the liver, colorectal cancer, inflammatory bowel disease, obesity, type 2 diabetes, and also other disorders of metabolism. Clearly, if you look at studies in these particular populations, there is a very substantial difference, in particular in the type of species of bacteria in the guts of people that have these various diseases. And we've had numerous opportunities to expand this list to other diseases, but also to go into more depth into some of these specific disease areas. For example, this is work which has recently come out that looks more in detail at differences not only in the species that exist in people that have colorectal cancer compared to people that don't, but also what are differences in the metabolism of what those particular bacteria are metabolizing, or the metabolites that exist in people's gut who have colorectal cancer and those who do not. So the question really becomes, what is the microbiome and how do we define it in the state of health, and how do we define the microbiome in the state of disease? So now I want to turn to the next question, is what actually influences our gut microbiome? What actually affects our microbiome, and how do we actually think about the microbiome as potentially a modifiable risk factor for health? And so this has led to much interest in diet. And as we all think about diet, we also want to consider the fact that diet is ultimately how our bodies are able to both thrive and function. So we obviously need to eat, and we need to eat food to be able to nourish our bodies and to fuel our metabolism. So it stands to good reason that diet also probably has a role in determining our gut microbes, because the diet is obviously something that we ingest and has ability to come into contact with bacteria and other microorganisms in our gut. So you can imagine that the diet and the things that we ingest into our body influences the kinds of bacteria that live in our gut, and also affect, for example, what those bacteria produce in terms of metabolites. And so that's been a clear relationship that's been unearthed by numerous studies done in very specific populations, and also most recently in studies that have been done in settings where patients and individuals have been put and prescribed very precise precision nutrition diets to assess how do specific nutrients and specific dietary compounds influence our gut microbiome. And I'll talk more about this later in the talk. So clearly we understand the role of diet both in terms of our health, and now we're understanding more about the role of diet in determining our gut microbiome's composition and function. In other words, what are the bacteria in our microbiome, and how does that microbiome function? So just to give an example of how this has evolved, colorectal cancer is a leading area in which microbiome research has made significant advances. So as many of you know, colorectal cancer is a very important cause of cancer and cancer-related death. In Hong Kong, it's actually the second leading cause of cancer death behind lung cancer. And of the cancers, colorectal cancer is the one that seems to be most strongly associated with the gut microbiome based on research that's been done so far. And so this actually then gives us an example of where we can really tease out the fact that diet and microbiome are probably interacting with each other to determine someone's colorectal cancer risk. So this, for example, was a study that was conducted to examine over 1,000 healthy individuals to determine what is it about people's environment, lifestyle, and other factors that could explain variation in the composition of the gut microbiome. And what was found is that about 20% of someone's variation in microbiome, meaning about 20% of the difference in your microbiome compared to the person sitting next to you, was explained by what you eat. So clearly diet plays an important role in determining what it is that actually your diet, how it is that your diet actually affects the composition of the bacteria in your gut. In addition, we also know there's an important role in colorectal diet and colorectal cancer. So colorectal cancer is a cancer in which there clearly are a list of environmental and lifestyle factors that are associated with risk. And these are a list of factors that we know are associated with developing colorectal cancer. And if you look at the risk factors that have been developed through epidemiological studies, much of the risk of colorectal cancer could be explained by diet. So the fact that much of the variance in our microbiome is related to diet, and much of the variation in cancer risk is related to diet, it stands to reason that diet and microbiome might be linked together to explain colorectal cancer risk. And as I mentioned, colorectal cancer is a very significant public health problem. It's the second most common cause of death throughout the world. It's also the third most common cancer in terms of incidence across the world. And you can see that there are marked geographic variations in colorectal cancer incidence. So the darker colors on the map illustrate areas where there's higher colorectal cancer incidence. And you can see that there's very dark colors here. And there's major problems now with colorectal cancer emerging in Asia and also other parts of the world. And this variation actually could certainly be explained in part by variation in both diet, but also variation in microbiome across different populations and different racial ethnic groups. So let's go more deeply into this diet microbiome colorectal cancer risk. So why would the microbiome potentially be linked to colorectal cancer? So why would the bacteria or the viruses that live in symbiosis in your bowels actually affect your risk of developing cancer? Well, there's a few plausible explanations, and many of these explanations have been developed from laboratory studies and studies in mice and animals. And what's been shown is that the microbiome seems to play a very important role in multiple immune factors. It seems to play an important role in altering the balance of your colon cells with their ability to grow and also evolve. And sometimes if there's an alteration in the ability of your colon cells to develop and your cells grow in an uncontrolled way, that is why you develop a cancer. In addition, we also understand the microbiome plays a very important role in immunity. In other words, how does your immune system actually fight off different abnormalities that happen in your normal cells? So our immune system, for example, will remove cells that start to develop into cancers, and if the microbiome actually affects that immune system, then your immune system becomes less able to remove cancerous cells. And then the last is we know the microbiome actually plays a role in metabolism and plays a role in actually producing various proteins and metabolites in your colon that may have a role in the health of your colon lining and in the lining's development of cancer. And there have been specific studies that have also been able to uncover bacteria that may have a particular role in colorectal cancer. For example, there has been clear associations with a bacteria known as Fusobacterium nucleatum. There's also been an association with something called enterotoxigenic Bacteroides fragilis, a type of Bacteroides bacteria. And then also a very common bacteria in your colon called E. coli. There's a specific subtype of E. coli called PKS positive E. coli. These are all microbes that have been linked to the development of cancer. In addition, there are certain sets of gut microbes that actually may be associated with a lower risk of cancer, specifically gut microbes that lead to the production of things called short-chain fatty acids, which are anti-inflammatory metabolites that could lead to better colon health and prevention of cancer. So there are very plausible links between specific bacteria and development of cancer. So how is it that this actually then interacts with diet? Because as I mentioned, diet seems to play a strong role in colorectal cancer. And it's been well established that diet and what you eat plays a role in risk. We know, for example, that high intake of red meat and fatty foods is associated with a higher risk of colon cancer. So is it possible that this dietary link with cancer development could be mediated in part by the gut microbiome through pathways that are related to host metabolism and immunity? And there's been several different hypotheses behind why these things could occur in the body, and this is summarized in a review article that we wrote back in 2020 that summarizes different lifestyle factors and their association with cancer risk, and many of these different lifestyle factors, in particular diet, may play a role in determining specific gut microbiome composition and microbiome function that in turn affects pathways that are linked with colorectal cancer risk. For example, inflammation, immunity, and other cellular pathways that could lead to development of cancer. So how do we think about where the evidence is? Is there evidence that there is an association between the microbiome and cancer risk? And what we need to rely on is sort of indirect evidence to start with, because it's very difficult to actually manipulate the microbiome in humans to be able to determine whether it associates with cancer in a controlled way. Those are very difficult kinds of experiments to do. So we start to look at epidemiological data. What are associations, for example, between things that we know alter the gut microbiome, and do they associate with risk? So one of the things that we do know affects the gut microbiome is exposure to antibiotics. And as you might imagine, antibiotics are designed to actually kill bacteria, and when they're used properly, they're designed to kill bacteria that are causing infections in our body. But exposure to antibiotics can also affect the microbes that live in our gut. And if you think about antibiotics as being very powerful drugs that actually can wipe out a microbiome, they are probably the strongest sort of exposure that we are exposed to as humans that will potentially affect our microbiome in a negative manner. So there have been many studies that have shown that individuals exposed to antibiotics have significant alterations in their microbes. There's less diversity, less types of bacteria that live in your bowel. There's a shift in the type of bacteria. And there's also shifts in directions that are potentially very harmful in terms of the kinds of metabolites that emerge from bacteria. And if you're repeatedly exposed to antibiotics, it's clear that you are potentially leading to a long-term state in which your gut microbiome is unhealthy compared to someone who's not been exposed to antibiotics. So then, what if we look at the association of antibiotics with cancer risk? Because we have the availability of antibiotic data from large databases, or also have the ability to track people's exposure to antibiotics and see how it eventually associates with the development of colorectal cancer. So we conducted this study, and this is one of the earliest studies really demonstrating an association between antibiotics and cancer risk through a study that was done of over 1,200 women enrolled in a health study in which we examined their exposure to antibiotics at different points in their life course, and found that the women that were exposed to antibiotics most frequently during their lifespan had the highest risk, as seen here, about a 1.7-fold higher risk of developing a colon polyp or a precancerous polyp that was destined to become a cancer. So this was very early evidence that antibiotics disrupting your microbiome could be a risk factor for developing colon polyps or colon cancer. And that's been subsequently corroborated by other studies that have looked at changes and variation in the bacteria that are in your colon if you have cancer versus people that don't have cancer, or if you have polyps that don't have cancer. And so across different epidemiological studies and case control studies, you see very clear differences in the kinds of microbes that exist in patients with cancer versus not. So there's a clear link between microbiome and cancer risk that's emerged through this constellation of evidence. In particular, I want to focus on one bacteria that I mentioned. This is Fusobacterium nucleatum. This is a bacteria that's actually found very commonly in our mouths. So most people here today have Fusobacterium in their mouth. And it's a very common microorganism that lives in your teeth. But for whatever reason, most people are able to handle these bacteria, and it doesn't ultimately lead to contamination farther down into your gastrointestinal tract. But people who develop colorectal cancer, for whatever reason, seem to actually transit this bacteria down into their stomach, into their colon, and it's been found that people with colon cancer have an enrichment of Fusobacterium nucleatum in their stool and in their colon compared to people that do not have colon cancer. So now I want to step into the question, how does potentially diet affect our microbiome, and does diet explain some of these associations between Fusobacterium nucleatum and colon cancer? So we wanted to do a study looking at dietary patterns in colon cancer and how that ultimately links with bacteria in our colon. So this was a study in which we looked at dietary patterns and cancer risk. So we divided people up into whether they consume more of a Western-style diet, which is comprised of saturated fat, low fiber, et cetera, and looked at that potential association with cancer risk with the idea that this particular dietary pattern has been linked to detrimental microbes. In particular, it's been linked to microbes that produce a lot of hydrogen sulfide or may cause a lot of inflammation and toxicity in someone's colon. In contrast, there's another dietary pattern known as the prudent dietary pattern, which is comprised of whole grains, fruit and vegetables, fiber, et cetera. And these are linked to healthier bacteria that may have anti-inflammatory effects. And so we've shown in various epidemiological studies that people who consume a more Western diet have a higher risk of cancer compared to people who consume a prudent diet. So how does that actually potentially link to Fusobacterium nucleatum? So we developed this hypothetical model that maybe an association between Western diet and colorectal cancer could be linked by this particular bacteria. Is it possible that diet may affect the abundance of Fusobacterium nucleatum in our colon and may actually lead to the development of colorectal cancer through a bacterial mechanism? So to address this, we did this study where we looked at a large cohort of over 121,000 female nurses that reside in various parts of the US, and also a cohort of 51,000 male health professionals who have been followed with updated dietary surveys since the 1980s. So every 2 years they fill out a dietary survey, and we can track what their intake is of various dietary components, and actually classify people into a Western diet or a prudent diet. We can then follow these people over time for the development of colorectal cancer. Among these two cohorts of people, we identified 3,000 people in over almost 180,000 people who developed colorectal cancer over follow-up. We then collected the tissue from these people that developed cancer and profiled as to whether they actually were affected by the Fusobacterium nucleatum. And we found that there was about 125 people who developed colon cancer in which there was enrichment of this particular bacteria in their colon. And then we asked the question, does diet associate with risk of cancer differently whether you develop the cancer based on the development of the bacteria versus not? And we found a very interesting result. So among individuals that were profiled for Fusobacterium, we found that there was really no association between a Western diet and the development of a tumor that did not have the bacteria. But if you compare that to a population of people who did have the bacteria, people who consumed a Western diet in the highest sort of tier of Western diet had about 1.7-fold higher risk of developing a Fusobacterium nucleatum-based colorectal cancer, suggesting that the diet cancer effect in this population was potentially mediated by the development of cancers that were dependent on this particular bacteria. On the flip side, remember, prudent diet is associated with lower risk of cancer, but seems to be associated only with colon cancers that were Fusobacterium, a lower risk of Fusobacterium positive cancer. So if you were looking just at the risk of developing a cancer that was not dependent on the bacteria, there was no difference in risk depending on whether you had a prudent diet or not. But in this category of individuals, people in the highest quartile of Fusobacteria of prudent diet had about a 60% low risk of developing a Fusobacterium positive colon cancer compared to those that were in the lowest quartile of a prudent diet. So these dietary associations may potentially be mediated by this bacteria. We've also expanded this work into other areas of diet. In particular, we developed a sulfur microbial diet score. So within some of these cohorts, we've collected stool samples, and within these stool samples, we're able to actually isolate DNA from the stool samples that are associated with bacteria and profile the bacteria for different profile the DNA to determine what bacteria are in their gut. And what we found here was that we could identify a group of bacteria that tend to produce sulfur, which is damaging to the colon, and identify a list of bacteria that tend to produce more sulfur, and understand what are the dietary patterns that that lead to a bacterial composition that tends to create more hydrogen sulfide. And we found that individuals that consume diets that tend to promote the sulfur-reducing bacteria tend to have a higher risk of developing colon cancer, about a 1.5-fold higher risk of developing colon cancer compared to people that consumed a diet that would predict lower sulfur-reducing bacteria. So there is an association of sulfur bacteria and the development of sulfur bacteria that's mediated by diet that could lead to a higher colorectal cancer risk. And this was also true in another study that we conducted looking at women. So it seems to be a trend that we see both in men and women. And then we also wanted to ask the question, does it affect risk of developing, for example, cancers or polyps in people that are younger? So we've been seeing a very alarming trend in the development of cancers at younger ages now. So we now know that although colorectal cancer used to be a disease primarily of older adults, more and more young people are getting it. And we've also seen associations here between people who consume a diet that promotes sulfur bacteria and risk of developing a colon polyp when someone is younger. So now I want to switch gears and talk about the association of diet with another major area of health, which is in metabolic health. So when I talk about metabolic health, I'm talking about the ability for people to maintain a healthy metabolism, to stay relatively lean, to avoid overweight, obesity, and also avoid metabolic diseases like diabetes. So this is something that really emerged out of our discovery that there is significant variation in how people respond to diet. So as you probably have noticed, not everybody has the same relationship between diet and metabolism. Some people, for example, may consume a relatively similar diet to another person, but that person tends to gain more weight than somebody else. So how do you explain those variations in people's metabolic response to diet? Well, this has been exemplified by studies that have shown, for example, that if you compare different individuals, there's different responses to eating the same foods. So this, for example, is a graph that shows how if you give people the same standardized meal, there's differences in people's blood sugar and how quickly it rises. There's also differences in the way people respond to their blood sugar and how their blood sugar and insulin levels respond after they consume a diet. So what really accounts for that variation in response to diet between different individuals? So one of the things that we wanted to really focus on in particular was postprandial peaks. So in particular, what happens to your blood sugar, what happens to your lipid levels, and what happens to your insulin levels after you eat a meal is strongly associated with other metabolic outcomes. So it's been shown in various studies that people who tend to have very high spikes in their blood glucose after they eat tend to have a higher risk of developing multiple problems with their blood vessels. They tend to get more lipoprotein remodeling, dysfunction of their blood vessels. They get higher levels of insulin, and they also tend to stay hungry and have a difficulty in controlling their appetite. And these areas have also been subsequently linked with later risk of developing heart disease, diabetes, and gaining weight. So how high your blood sugar spikes after you eat a meal is a risk factor for the development of all these chronic diseases. So knowing that, we wanted to embark on a study to determine how does our diet influence how our blood sugar spikes after a meal, and is that blood sugar spike something that is related to the gut microbiome. So we started a study in collaboration with a group in the United Kingdom called the PREDICT study, in which we were able to enroll over 1,000 individuals in the UK and 100 individuals in Boston in a very detailed clinical trial in which we collected very precise information on how people responded to meals by collecting blood, stool, and tissue samples after they had meals over a one-day period when they were in the clinic and over a two-week period when they were living at home. And this is the day one in the clinic. You can see they spent about a day in the clinic where we timed their receipt of a meal and timed their blood draws and collected a lot of different informations about their metabolism. And then after they went home for 2 weeks, we also collected information on what they were eating, gave them standardized meals, collected blood, and also collected stool samples to profile their microbiome. And this led to some very important studies that demonstrated that postprandial glucose response, or how your blood sugar spikes after a meal, does really, is something that's controllable by diet. In addition, we found that a lot of those associations were related to differences in the microbiome. So we asked the first question, the basic question is, what causes that variability in those blood glucose spikes? And we looked at a lot of different factors, including some blood markers, some risk factors, and demographic factors like age, what they were eating, their blood pressure, et cetera. And then we also looked at their genetics. And we actually found that there was, for triacylglycerol, which is lipids, that there was not a very strong association of genetics at all with the ability of your triglycerides to rise after a meal, but there was a very strong association with microbiome and other factors. And glucose response was also very strongly linked to microbiome, as you can see here. So your gut microbiome and what's in your microbiome may actually play a very specific role in how much your blood glucose spikes after you eat a meal. And then we looked at this in a different way. So one way that we actually assess microbiome variation is how diverse your microbiome is. For example, is there a lot of bacteria in your microbiome, or is there only a few bacteria? And the more diverse your microbiome, the better, the healthier. And we found that there was clear associations between diversity of microbiome and various factors, including weight, visceral fat, body mass index, and other lipid measures as well. So there are clear biomarkers that associate with how diverse your microbiome is, which really show the fact that microbiome is a strong risk factor and strong determinant of metabolic health as measured by different proteins and also different demographic factors. And then we also did some machine learning studies to understand what is it about our diet that actually may link up with changes in our microbiome, and actually showed quite clearly that microbiome tends to be a very strong predictor of our diet is a very strong predictor of our microbiome, and that we can actually understand and predict what's in our microbiome based on the foods that we eat. So that diet microbiome link is very strong in terms of being able to reflect what's in your gut, and also ultimately very strongly related to our metabolism and our ability to, for example, determine how much our blood glucose spikes after a meal. We also were able to link specific bacteria with specific foods. So if you combine, for example, our dietary patterns into different formulas, we can, for example, call out a healthy plant-based diet or a less healthy plant-based diet, or unhealthy animal-based or healthy animal-based diets. And we see quite clearly there are associations between some of these healthy dietary patterns and specific bacteria, and there's associations with our less healthy or unhealthy dietary patterns and specific bacteria as well. So what we eat and the kinds of foods that are in our diet predict very specific groups of bugs and bacteria that reside in our microbiome and potentially be an important determinant of human health. So we then wanted to turn to the question, can we actually use diet to optimize our microbiome in a way that actually impacts our eventual human health? So we did this epidemiological study where we took a microbiome-based diet based upon the results of this PREDICT study and developed a score that predicted the healthiest microbiome based on the foods that we're eating. And then linked that score ultimately with whether someone was going to potentially gain or lose weight over time. And we found a very interesting result. When we derived this microbiome score and we derived a diet that was going to potentially predict the healthiest microbiome, those people that had a diet that predicted the healthiest microbiome gained the least amount of weight over time compared to people in the lowest quartile of that diet. So the more you adhere to a dietary pattern that would predict a healthy microbiome, the less weight you gained over time. So clearly linking potentially the association of microbiome with better metabolic health, which ultimately has implications for other chronic diseases like diabetes, which is strongly related to weight gain, and also cardiovascular disease. So with that, I want to summarize sort of where we're at with the microbiome and summarize what I've covered today. I hope I've been able to lay a foundation for you in terms of understanding what the gut microbiome is and what it actually contributes to human health and how it actually may be a strong contributor to how healthy we are able to stay and how and whether or not we develop a chronic disease. We also know that the gut microbiome probably is an important mediator between diet and health associations. So I think we're all very familiar with diet and how important that is in terms of maintaining our health and how an unhealthy diet may lead to various diseases like heart disease or cancer. And those links have been established for many, many years, and many of those links actually may be in part due to the effect of diet on our gut microbes. As particular examples, we know that colorectal cancer and other metabolic diseases like obesity, overweight, diabetes, and weight gain are clearly linked to the microbiome, and so these relationships are now starting to become very clear for these diseases, and I think will continue to become clear for other chronic diseases, particularly diseases of immunity. And there's more and more examples of associations between things like diet and autoimmune disease that may be mediated by the gut microbiome. And so we're really at a point now in the field where we need to understand more about how we can use our diet to actually tilt our microbiome into a healthier state. And that probably will rely on the development of both dietary recommendations that may be tailored to the microbiome, but also potentially allowing us to have a very individualized approach. You can imagine that a particular dietary approach in one person could lead to a different microbiome in one person compared to another. So the future, I think, will potentially lie in developing precision nutrition strategies in which people are able to eat and actually get some feedback as to what they're eating and how that's actually impacting the microbiome as a way to potentially promote long-term health. And I think that's ultimately a very exciting way for us to think about nutrition and a very exciting way for us to think about how we can use food as a way to maintain human health. So with that, I want to thank you for your attention. I also want to be able to recognize the people within our research group in Boston for whom these studies would not have been possible. And also acknowledge the participants in our studies, our clinical studies, both at Mass General Hospital, but also some of our epidemiological studies, which enroll people from all across the United States. And with that, again, I thank you for your attention, and I look forward to some question and answers. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Chan, for the educational and informative talk. Please be seated on stage. I'm sure that there will be some questions from the floor, So may I now invite Professor Wong, the moderator of today's lecture, to come up and host the Q&A session. Professor Wong, please.
So thank you very much, Professor Chan. So congratulations. I think everybody would agree that this lecture is actually very insightful and in fact actually quite useful because it can be translational in terms of how we take our diet. So thank you very much for these very useful messages and recent, innovative research. So I think it's time for question and answer. Let's see if we got any colleagues, distinguished guests, and students who might have questions. Probably, usually the moderator will take the first question. Now, usually in my clinic, I would actually recommend my patients to take diet following the food pyramid, which is very traditional, and I think it actually originated from US. So, but then, however, some of my doctor friends are telling me that now we should cut our carbohydrates, eating more plants and also red meat. So do you think if we recommend a traditional food pyramid, that would in fact already good enough to optimize our gut microbiome composition? Thank you.
That's a very good question. I think that, as you allude to, there have been a lot of shifts, I think, in dietary recommendations over time. It used to be, for example, strongly emphasize that we should avoid fat, and fat was the main culprit that led to obesity, heart disease, etc. And we paid little attention to, for example, carbohydrates. And then there's been kind of a shift away from that now where we're thinking more that excessive intake of carbohydrates actually may be detrimental. And some fats actually may be healthy. For example, unsaturated fats, fats that come from olive oil, etc., things that are more seen in a Mediterranean diet are actually more healthy and should be encouraged as opposed to very strict adherence to a low-fat diet. So I think those dietary recommendations are shifting, and that has shifted, I think, largely in response to epidemiological studies that have shown that certain dietary patterns do seem to be linked with health in different ways. That being said, though, I think those shifting recommendations have led to a lot of confusion, and I think it's also been a situation where dietary recommendations are very challenging for the general population to both understand and adhere to. And so the sort of one-size-fits-all message about diet has been very challenging, and I think also has developed into a situation where some dietary recommendations may make sense for some patients and may not make sense for others, which is why I think the field, excitingly, I think, is leading to a potentially more precision nutrition approach where we can start to fine-tune dietary recommendations according to someone's physiologic response to food. So, for example, in the PREDICT study that I showed, that study demonstrated that a dietary pattern could be developed that would minimize the spikes in blood glucose that happen after you eat a meal. And those are probably physiologic effects that will predict lower risk of developing heart disease and diabetes down the road. And so if you can tailor your diet to minimize some of these physiological responses to food, that may be better for you long term. So I think a precision nutrition-based diet that incorporates that kind of information, also incorporates other aspects of physiology like microbiome, will be the wave of the future. And I think that will excitingly be combined in different ways through machine learning, artificial intelligence, et cetera, where we take all these data points and start to develop algorithms to better define dietary patterns for individuals using multiple kinds of data.
Thanks very much. Yes, indeed, my colleagues tell me that we should advise patients not to take the high glycemic food, the food with high glycemic index, like congee, simple sugar, and these are even more detrimental as compared to other foods in terms of disturbances of the gut microbiome environment, right?
Correct.
All right, okay.
And the very interesting studies, for example, have shown that white rice versus brown rice, for example, may have very specific differences in physiological impact. Some of that may also be mediated by gut microbiome. So there's some sort of broad dietary associations that are important to keep in mind, but ultimately, again, we will want to probably get to a point where we can be more tailored.
Okay, thank you very much. So let's see if we got any questions from the floor. Yes, I can see one. So maybe we could have a microphone for you. All right, thank you.
Hi, Professor Chen. Apart from our daily diets, I understand that probiotics could also affect our gut microbiome in a beneficial way. So would it be appropriate for people with a normal gut microbiome, relatively normal gut microbiome, to take probiotics as a daily supplement? Or do you think people should rather focus on their diets more? Because as far as I comprehend, seems like there's still not enough strong evidence to support the specific benefits of probiotics on the human body. So that's the question.
Yeah, that's a very good question. So one thing I didn't have a chance to get into depth about was probiotics. There is a lot of interest in probiotics, which are specifically formulations in which you can ingest particular bacterial communities and try to repopulate your gut with those bacteria. And there's been a lot of interest in this approach because it seems like a very straightforward way to modify our microbiome. I think the challenge has been whether those probiotics can meaningfully and durably affect your microbiome in a way that will lead to better health outcomes. Most of the studies of probiotics in specific conditions have been somewhat disappointing in really showing some long-term benefits. There have been some examples where there have been benefits, but in general, long-term prolonged consumption of probiotics has not really borne out some of the promises that were originally hoped. And that could be because we're not able to stably alter our microbiome with probiotics, that there also may be some regression back to the mean, if you will, in terms of our microbes, that over time a person, for example, becomes more resistant to the effect of probiotics and being able to populate with specific bacteria. So there is an interest in trying to use other approaches like diet where potentially you can more durably affect your microbiome in a positive way over the long term. There's also an interest in prebiotics, and prebiotics basically are, for example, ingesting certain foods or certain fibers, for example, that provide fuel for your bacteria and encourage your gut bacteria to grow in a certain way. So prebiotic strategies may be potentially effective. There's also strategies that try to combine prebiotics with probiotics. So I think there's a lot of different approaches that people are testing, and I think it'll be very interesting to see what the results of those studies will be. Our group has really focused on diet because we've seen such clear association with diet, and all of us obviously need to eat something, right? So we all have to try to diet's something that is very modifiable and something that we all have control over. And ultimately, if we are able to affect our microbiome in the most positive way with diet, the addition of things like probiotics or prebiotics in the future may only be of added benefit. But I think we have to start with a foundation related to the food that we're eating.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yes, I agree totally. In fact, there's one slide talking about the association between antibiotic prescription and also the change in gut microbiome. So in Hong Kong recently, it's now more and more common for general practitioners when they actually prescribe antibiotic for common cold or flu, they also co-prescribe microbiome formula for a week. Mm-hmm. What do you think about this practice? Should I really follow?
I think that's also been something that's becoming more popular in the U.S. too. I would say that the data to support that approach are still limited. So it's not something that I generally recommend as a universal practice. Does it hurt? Probably not. Is it worth it? I think it is a trade-off of cost, and other things. So, I think it's probably something that needs further study. But the trials so far that have been done to look at the effect of probiotics in preventing complications related to bacteria have been very mixed. And I don't think the evidence is very consistent, so it's hard to really make it a general recommendation.
Thank you very much. So we look forward to future research at the meantime. So let's see if we got any other questions.
Professor
right.
Chen,
Okay, thanks.
thanks for your excellent pre. I'm a third-year PhD student conducting gut microbiome. I want to inquire you, do you have any postdoctoral positions available next year?
In Harvard? Or
Yeah.
We're always looking for talented fellows, so if you have an interest, just let me know. But we have a research group is diverse in terms of background and specialty, and people come to our group with different interests and different skills. So depending on your background and your skills, we're always happy to talk about opportunities.
Okay, thank you. So hope you're satisfied with this answer. So no harm to try, right? Or write an email to Professor Chen to try a little bit. Okay, so yes, yes, there's one more question. Thank you very much.
Thank you for sharing about the gut microbiome. So I have one question, and that is related to healthy diet. So like over the years, I've heard many theories surrounding how to have a heavy diet. For example, like the food pyramid. Then people started talking about low GI food, and then now you're talking about food that is good for your gut microbiome. So there are many theories surrounding a healthy diet, and do you think that these theories will coexist, or do you think that one theory will replace the other theories? Yeah, thank you.
I think that's an excellent question. I think I was trying to maybe make the point that dietary recommendations are very tricky, and they have shifted a lot over time. And so we work with the best available data, and so things have shifted over time, and I think we're getting to better and better evidence to sort of support certain dietary patterns and approaches are probably better than others. That being said, I think there's always going to be a fundamental limitation in that approach, and that it's going to be difficult to imagine a single dietary pattern being one that we should recommend universally. And I think that there will always be shifts, I think, in our recommendations that will be confusing. And I think what will probably need to happen, again, is a move toward a more personalized approach to diet and trying to not just broadly recommend foods to people, but also to think about trying to characterize people's response to foods physiologically and also use other parameters of their metabolism, for example, their gut microbiome, as a way to help modify what they're eating or help guide people into eating in a way that I think will predict better health outcomes. And I think that approach will probably be more successful in the long run than throwing out a lot of recommendations where they're difficult, again, to understand, difficult to adhere to, and also may not provide the same benefits to a given individual.
Okay, thank you. Well, in fact, I can see from one of the bar charts saying that, in fact, physical activity seems to rank even higher as compared to diet in terms of the influence on gut microbiome. So is there, well, our head is in fact an expert in this area. So what do you think are the major reasons that physical activity also play a role here?
Yeah, so diet's been an area we've focused on. We've had some studies in physical activity as well. I think physical activity is also enormously important in health broadly, but also potentially in impacting our microbiome. And some of the associations of physical activity with health are plausibly related to microbiome changes too. So that's an important area of research that needs to be looked into more deeply. The PREDICT study that I mentioned that we were a part of not only assessed diet, but also assessed physical activity as well, because there is probably associations between physical activity and how people physiologically respond to food which are maybe mediated by the microbiome, but also maybe mediated by other factors too. So as you might imagine, there's probably differences in how your body responds to food depending on whether you exercise just before you ate or whether you exercise after you eat. So timing of exercise, timing of meals, timing of these things relative to when you go to sleep, how much you sleep, all these biological factors probably have important interactive roles with one another. And that's where I think we need to think about more personalized approaches where we can take all of that information and try to put it into algorithms, for example, using machine learning and other data structures, where we can take that wealth of information and try to develop algorithms to predict optimal responses for people, both in terms of optimal things that they may want to eat, optimal times of day they should exercise, optimal times they should go to sleep, things like that.
Yes, so thank you very much. Yes, let's see if you have any further questions. Yes, well, if we don't, then let's thank Professor, our Professor Andrew Chan in our usual way. Thank you so very much.
Thank you.